My name is Margaret Hillman. I'm 69 years old, and on the day my husband's will was read, my life nearly vanished in a single morning. The conference room was packed. My two sons, Richard and Paul, sat on either side of the long table, dressed in fine suits, faces cold as stone. In front of them lay a thick stack of papers prepared by Attorney Monroe, the final will of Thomas Hillman, the man I had been married to for 45 years. When Mrs. Monroe began reading, her voice was as steady as the ticking clock in the silent room. I leave to my eldest son, Richard, the entire Hillman & Sons construction company, valued at $12 million. Richard smiled, a victorious smile I hadn't seen since the day his father died. To my younger son, Paul Hillman, I leave the Hillman Dine restaurant chain, bringing in $8 million a year, along with the luxury apartments, sports cars, and all related properties. Paul leaned back in his chair, nodding with satisfaction, as though he'd just won the lottery. I sat quietly at the corner of the table, my hands trembling, waiting to hear my name. 45 years of marriage. I had been there for Thomas through every phase of his life. Those nights he stayed up drafting business plans, the morning I sold my mother's wedding ring to fund his first project, the long years raising our children alone while he traveled for work. I wasn't expecting much, just a small token of security, a simple gesture of thanks. Then Mrs. Monroe paused, glanced at the papers, and finally said my name. And to my wife, Margaret Hillman. My heart pounded. I leave this personal envelope. Mrs. Monroe pulled out an old yellow envelope, its edges faded with a thin layer of dust, like ash, across its surface. No jewelry box, no house keys, no stock certificates, just an envelope. My daughter-in-law Emily let out a short laugh. At least she can use it to store her recipes. That laugh was as cold as a blade. Richard didn't even look at me. Paul sighed as if I were some inconvenient obligation. I took the envelope. It was so light it felt empty. After 45 years together, that was all I got. I rose and walked out of that elegant room in silence. No one said goodbye. No one asked if I was all right. The door closed behind me and Emily's laughter echoed in my mind. Outside, the sky was gray. I stood on the office steps, the envelope in my hand. Dust shimmered gold under the sunlight, and through that thin layer, I saw Thomas's handwriting, the same hand that had written me hundreds of love letters in our youth, for the woman who always loved me. I didn't understand. I didn't know whether to be angry, to cry, or to laugh. I only knew my heart was breaking. If you've ever believed that a single act can change an entire life, subscribe to this channel. Here we share real stories of love, of trust, and of people brave enough to begin again, even when everything seems lost. I left the office and walked down the street where Thomas and I had once laid the very first bricks of our company. Everything was still there, the stores, the buildings, the signs bearing his name, everything but me. That night, I sat alone in our empty house, in his favorite leather chair. The envelope lay on the table, quiet as an unhealed wound. I almost threw it away, but something stopped me, a feeling, or maybe the last bit of love I still had for the man I thought I knew so well. I touched the words again, for the woman who always loved me. I whispered, "Thomas, what have you done?" And I had no idea that in just a few hours when I opened that envelope, my life, the life of the woman everyone in the family saw as useless, would change forever. That night, my house was terrifyingly quiet. The ticking of the wall clock filled the room, reminding me that time still moved on, only I had been left behind. Beside me, Thomas's armchair still bore the familiar indentation where he used to sit. I had set the table and poured 2 cups of tea out of habit, then realized his cup would never be touched again. I sat for hours, staring at the envelope on the table. The thin film of dust on its edge glowed faintly under the yellow lamp, dim light, like the faint pulse of my own life. All those years beside him, I never imagined I'd one day feel so meaningless. I had walked every step of the way with him, from the shabby apartment we rented when we were young to the tall buildings that now bore the Hillman name. I sold my mother's wedding ring so he could start his business, stayed up through countless nights making coffee for him, and took our sick children to the hospital alone while he was away on business. No one in the family knew how exhausted I had been back then, but I never complained because I believed we were a team. That's what I kept telling myself after he died. When my sons grew distant, when Emily, my daughter-in-law, said coldly, "You should just live quietly, Mom, and stay out of men's work." I had believed the will was just a formality, that Thomas, the man I loved, would never leave me with nothing. But he had, or at least, that's what I thought. Night deepened. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered, a world I once belonged to, now visible only through glass. I sighed and picked up the envelope with trembling hands. It was so light it might as well have been empty. Maybe it's just a goodbye letter, I whispered to myself, though a strange feeling stirred inside me, as if Thomas were still somewhere, waiting for me to discover something. I carefully tore open the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of yellowed paper, written in his familiar hand. For the woman who always loved me. Account number 2431CH at the International Bank of Geneva, Switzerland. What you find here is only the beginning. They don't deserve to know the truth, but you do. I read it over and over, each word cutting like a knife, yet sparking a fragile hope. A bank account in Geneva? Thomas had never mentioned it. He always claimed everything was transparent and handled within the country. I sat frozen, then suddenly stood up, heart racing. Part of me feared it was a cruel joke, but another part flickered with faint light. Maybe, just maybe, Thomas had kept his promise to protect me. The next morning, I called the bank. My voice shook, my English faltered. After I provided them with the details, the woman on the other end remained quiet for a long time. I heard the sound of typing, then her slow, deliberate words. "Mrs. Hillman, the current balance in this account is $100 million US. I couldn't believe my ears. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor. $100 million. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. After all the years of endurance, all the humiliation, Thomas had not forgotten me. But at the exact moment, a new question froze my heart. Why did he hide it from me? And what did he mean by, "They don't deserve to know the truth"? I stood there, looking around the silent house, once full of laughter. Now it was only me, and a secret unfolding layer by layer, like Pandora's box from our 45-year marriage. I knew then that I was about to step into the journey Thomas had left for me, a journey that would lead me to the truth and into the darkness within my own family. The next morning, when the knock came at my door, I still hadn't slept. I had spent the entire night staring at Thomas's handwriting on that piece of paper, feeling love, anger, and fear all tangled together. On the porch stood a delivery man in a black suit. He bowed politely. "Mrs. Hillman, we're from the International Bank of Geneva. This is a safety deposit box left in your name by Mr. Thomas Hillman, along with the code to unseal it." I signed the receipt, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The box was small, heavy, and cold, like it carried a secret from another world. On the envelope containing the code, Thomas had written a few words by hand. June 15, 1980, our wedding day. I closed the door and drew the curtains shut. Dim light filtered through the cracks, glinting off the gray steel surface. I turned the dials one by one. 1, 5, 8. A faint click. The door opened. Inside, there was no gold, no cash, only a stack of documents, a bundle of old photographs, and a large envelope with my name on it. I opened the letter. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and our sons have already shown you who they truly are. I'm sorry you had to endure that humiliation. It was necessary. I needed them to reveal themselves before you learned the whole truth. My hands trembled. The letter stretched over several pages, his handwriting steady and firm, each line carving deeper into memory. I discovered something terrible. Richard has been stealing money from the company for 3 years to pay off gambling debts. He owes over $2 million and is entangled with loan sharks. Paul is addicted to drugs and laundering money through the restaurant chain. I hired investigators, and all the evidence is here. I opened the folder. Inside were forged contracts, photos of Richard in casinos, debt receipts, and pictures of Paul standing with known drug dealers. But it was the final paragraph that stopped my heart. The most painful thing, Margaret, isn't their crimes. It's what they plan to do to you. One night, I overheard them in the study. They plan to declare you mentally incompetent, put you in a nursing home, and sell off everything. Emily was the first to suggest it. The letter slipped from my hands. The air around me thickened, pressing down until I could barely breathe. The children I had carried, held in my arms, taught to read, were planning to bury me alive while I was still breathing. I looked up at Thomas's picture on the wall. He was smiling kindly, as always, but now I saw something hidden behind that smile. Preparation. Strategy. The quiet cunning of a man who had always been one step ahead of me. I let them take $30 million so they'd believe they'd won. But you, Margaret, you're the one in control. You have $100 million and the truth. You'll know what to do. I folded the letter, tears blurring the ink. I was no longer just the betrayed wife. I was the one entrusted with a weapon to reclaim our honor. That night, for the first time since Thomas's funeral, I turned on the light in his study, spread the documents across the table, and whispered, "All right, Thomas, I understand. Now it's my turn." From that morning on, I no longer saw myself as a lonely older woman. I was someone holding a bomb in my hands, a bomb called the truth. I hid all of Thomas's documents inside a secret compartment of the old wooden cabinet, the same one that once held toys when Richard and Paul were little. That cabinet had stored memories of sweetness. Now it guarded the evidence that could destroy our family. The next afternoon, the phone rang. Richard's voice came through the speaker, syrupy and false. "Mom, we've been worried about you. The house is too big, and it's dangerous living alone. Emily and I have found a new place for you, comfortable, with doctors available 24/7. I paused for a few seconds, then smiled, a smile no one could see. "A place like a nursing home, dear?" I asked softly. "Not exactly. It's a luxury retirement community. It's called Willow Creek." I recognized the name instantly. Willow Creek, the very place mentioned in the contracts Thomas had left behind. They'd planned this long before he died. Feigning frailty, I replied, "That sounds nice. Let me think about it." That evening, Paul called. His voice was shaky, rehearsed. "Mom, I think Richard's right. You'd have friends there, people to take care of you. We'd feel better knowing you're safe." I chuckled, softly. "It's touching how much you both care." But deep down, I knew. They didn't care about me. They cared about the money. 3 days later, they came to the house. Emily entered first, smiling sweetly enough to rot teeth. "Mom, I brought some brochures for you to look at. Only the best places. Some even have tennis courts." I nodded, made tea, and pretended to be tired. While they chatted, I discreetly turned on a small recorder hidden under the tablecloth. Richard opened his laptop and slid some papers toward me. "We've already prepared your medical documents, Mom. All that's left is for the doctor to sign them." "What doctor?" I asked. "Just someone we know. He's very professional." I noticed the faint tremor in Richard's voice, the way his eyes avoided mine. They were building their wall of lies brick by brick, but they had no idea I already had an entire fortress of evidence ready to bring it down. That night, I sat by the window, staring at the lights from Richard's house across the street. In the darkness, I saw them step out of their car, speaking in hushed tones. I grabbed the small binoculars Thomas used for bird watching and focused on them. Emily was handing Richard a bundle of papers. He nodded, his eyes cold as steel. There was no doubt anymore. They truly meant to get rid of me. I picked up the phone and called Attorney George Milton. "You were right, Thomas," I whispered as the line rang. After I told George everything, he spoke calmly. "Mrs. Hillman, let them make their move. The longer this goes on, the stronger our evidence will be. But remember, my people are watching your house at all times." I hung up and leaned back in the chair. The room was silent, moonlight spilling through the window and landing on the table, where a pile of Thomas's files lay. I looked at the family portrait hanging on the wall, my 2 young sons smiling brightly, Thomas and I standing behind them, hands on their shoulders. That photo had once been my pride and joy. Now it only made my chest tighten. I whispered to the man in the frame, "We raised those boys to be men, Thomas, but maybe they never truly grew up." That night, I wrote in my journal, "Day 1 of the battle. I will not cry anymore. From now on, I will watch, remember, and strike back, with the mind Thomas taught me to use." I closed the journal, my eyes landing once more on the old envelope. Who would have thought the thing they had mocked would be the very reason I found life again, not just to protect myself, but to restore the honor of my late husband. Outside, I heard Richard's car pulling away into the night. I watched the taillights fade and whispered like a vow, "My dear sons, I once taught you that a game only ends when you're out of cards, but I still have plenty left to play." Part 5. 3 days later, just as the first light of morning filtered through the window, the doorbell rang. I went to the door and found a man on the porch about the same age. Thomas had been in his healthy years, hair silver at the temples, neatly dressed in a black suit. He smiled, a smile both warm and sharp like a well-honed blade. "Good morning, Mrs. Hillman. I'm George Milton, the private attorney Mr. Thomas hired 2 years ago. He gave me a special assignment to contact you exactly 1 month after his death. Today is that day." I invited him in. In the living room, George set a leather briefcase on the table. He opened it, revealing stacks of files labeled with colored tabs: construction company, restaurant chain, anonymous shares, and protection fund. "Thomas prepared everything, Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice steady and sure. "He didn't just leave you money. He left you power." I frowned. "Power?" George nodded and pushed a dark blue folder toward me. "This is the incorporation agreement for Hillman Holdings. On paper, your 2 sons were apportioned the assets. In reality, all the companies are owned by a single legal entity, Hillman Holdings, and you are the legal owner of 51% of the shares." I sat stunned, as if I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So, I'm the one who controls the entire group?" "Exactly. Thomas arranged everything like a chess game. He knew his sons would be greedy, so he let them tie themselves up in clauses they didn't read carefully." George smiled slightly, admiration in his eyes. "He was a good chess player, but you, Mrs. Hillman, are the one making the final move." I flipped through the pages: powers of attorney, shareholder minutes, vote transfer documents, each signed by Thomas and duly notarized. My heart pounded, a mix of pride and bitterness. Thomas had trusted me until the very end, though he never said it aloud. He knew that if he revealed everything too soon, I wouldn't be strong enough to stand up to our children. George poured tea slowly and continued, "However, this isn't only about assets. Thomas also asked me to investigate your 2 sons over the past 3 years. The results, I'm afraid you need to prepare yourself." I gripped the armrests. George placed new photographs on the table: Richard signing checks with strange men in a bar, Paul handing a bag of cash to a tattooed man outside a restaurant. Richard withdrew more than $3 million from the construction company to pay debts. Paul turned the restaurant chain into a money laundering front for drug traffickers. If the police find out, both could be prosecuted. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The images of the children who once ran through the yard with balloons were gone, replaced by two men swallowed by darkness. "You have two choices," George said slowly. "You can hand everything to the authorities and watch them go to jail, or you can use this power to teach them the final lesson a mother can give: consequences and redemption." I opened my eyes. My reflection looked back at me in the teacup, calm and deep. "You know, George, my whole life I've rarely had the power to choose for myself. This time, I will choose." George nodded, understanding. Before he left, he set a small silver phone on the table. "This phone has only one red button. If you feel threatened, press it. My team and the police will arrive immediately." The door closed behind him, leaving me alone in a sunlit room. The folders lay on the table like weapons, and in the mirror I saw the image of a different woman, not a silent widow anymore. Still, the head of an empire waiting to be commanded. I smiled, a smile mixed with pain and pride. "Thomas, you played the opening move. Now it's my turn to command this board." That morning, I had just finished pouring my cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Richard, Emily, and a stranger in a white coat stood on the porch, the man holding a black leather briefcase. "Hello, Mother," Richard said, his tone so gentle it sounded fake. "We've asked a doctor to come do a general health check. It's just a few simple questions." I stood still for a moment, then smiled. How thoughtful. "Please come in." Inside, part of me was calm, while another part of me seethed. George had warned me. They would try to declare me incompetent and send me to a care facility. And now, the performance officially began. The stranger set the briefcase on the table and opened a few printed forms. "I'm Dr. Evans," he said, his voice unctuously pleasant. "We just want to ensure you're still lucid and healthy. I'll ask a few simple questions." "Go ahead," I answered, my voice light but as firm as steel. "What day is it today, ma'am?" "Friday, October 13th, I replied, looking him square in the eye. "Where do you live?" "At the house my husband and I built 30 years ago, 12-74 Oak Street." Richard nodded as if the exam were going smoothly. I noticed Emily glancing at her husband and giving a small, triumphant smile, as if everything were already in their hands. Then the doctor asked the following question: "Do you know how much your husband left you?" That was the trap. If I said just a dusty envelope, they'd use it as proof I didn't understand my finances, a sign of memory loss. If I said $200 million, they'd call me delusional. I inhaled slowly and answered calmly. I remember clearly. Richard received the construction company. Paul received the restaurant chain. I received an envelope, and in that envelope was everything I needed. I spoke slowly, each word striking like a small blade. Dr. Evans looked momentarily flustered and scribbled notes. "How do you feel about the division of those assets?" he asked. "I feel," I replied, looking straight at Richard and Emily, "that I finally know who in this family truly cares for me." The room fell silent. I watched Emily swallow. Richard lost his composure. They thought I was a gentle old woman who could be cajoled. They were wrong. A few minutes later, the doctor closed his file. "I think you should be placed under special medical supervision. There's an excellent facility, Willow Creek." I cut him off. "No need. I am healthy and perfectly aware I'm being set up." Richard sprang up. "Mother, don't make this difficult. The doctor only wants to help." "Help whom, my son?" I asked. "Me or the care home contract you reserved 2 weeks before your father died?" They both froze. Emily went pale. I took the small phone George Milton had given me from my jacket and switched the recorder on. "I want to record that. My son, my daughter-in-law, and this so-called doctor are attempting to coerce me into signing papers to commit me to psychiatric care against my will." "What is this, Mother?" Richard shouted and lunged to snatch the phone. I sidestepped. My voice no longer trembled, but thundered. "If you touch me, that will be an act of elder abuse. And believe me, the police are on their way." At that moment, there was a fierce pounding on the door. 2 police officers and George Milton entered, the red lights from the patrol car flashing through the windows. George spoke calmly. "Mr. Evans, or rather Mr. Carter, we have evidence you were paid by Richard Hillman to impersonate a psychiatrist. You're under arrest." The man went pale. Emily began to cry. Richard stood silent, eyes filled with panic. I looked at the 3 of them and felt no anger anymore, only a deep sadness. "My children," I said slowly, "what's most terrifying is not losing money, but losing one's humanity." The officers led them away. George turned to me and nodded gently. Everything unfolded exactly as Thomas planned. He anticipated this, so he prepared emergency protection orders. "You're safe now." When the door closed, I sat down. The room was tranquil. I poured another cup of coffee and whispered to Thomas's photograph on the wall, "See? They made their move. But this time, the one being fooled is not me." Outside, the afternoon sun streamed through the windows and lit my face, the face of a woman who had reclaimed her right to live, not by tears, but by courage. The next morning, my house was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of fear, it was the silence of power. On the table, the files George Milton had given me were neatly arranged. Inside were the proofs of Richard's and Paul's crimes, forged checks, loan papers, photographs, witness statements. Each page felt as heavy as a stone pressing on a mother's heart. I knew the time to confront them had come. That afternoon, I called both my sons. My voice was gentle but firm. "Tonight, 7 o'clock. Both of you come to the house. Bring no one. I need to talk." They were silent for a few seconds. Finally, Richard replied, his tone dry, "All right, Mother." At 7 o'clock, a car pulled up at the gate. Richard came in and Paul followed, thinner, gaunter than before, his eyes avoiding mine. Emily wasn't with them. The room was filled with warm yellow light, but no one felt warmth. I sat in the armchair facing the 2 sons I had once trusted to protect me. Now they looked like strangers. "Sit down." They sat. Richard began to speak, then I raised a hand to stop him. I placed a thick envelope on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of photos and papers. "These are the files about your gambling debt, Richard. These are the forged contracts you signed to siphon money from the company, and here are photos of Paul handing cash to drug traffickers." Both of them went pale. Paul hung his head. Richard clasped his hands to steady himself. "I know everything," I said, "and I also know what you plan to do to me. The contract to send me to Willow Creek, the fake doctor's signature, the deposit. It's all here." Silence fell. The wall clock ticked, counting each shameful second. Paul began to cry. "Mother, I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. I owe money. They threatened me." "And you thought the solution was to get rid of me first?" I cut in. My voice wasn't loud, but it made Richard lower his head. I studied them for a long time. "Do you know what your father did?" They looked up. I continued. "Your father knew everything. He didn't tell you. He quietly transferred the assets into my name to protect me from you." Paul choked. "He knew, and still let us, because he wanted to see how far you would fall." I stood and paced slowly around the room. "Now you have 2 paths. 1, I hand all this evidence to the police. 2, I give you one last chance to make amends. You choose." Richard lifted his head, trying to sound strong. "What do you want?" I stopped and looked him straight in the eye. "You will resign as director. All your shares will be temporarily transferred to my name. Starting tomorrow, you will work as a laborer at that very company, paid daily like everyone else, until you repay the $3 million you took." Richard's mouth fell open. "Mother, You want me to do manual labor? Your father began with his hands empty. If he could do it, so can you. I turned to Paul. And you, tomorrow you will enter a rehabilitation program. Not a luxury place. A real one that helps people rebuild their lives. I've spoken with the police. You will disclose the entire money laundering network and cooperate with the investigation. If you do as required, you will avoid prison. Paul sobbed and nodded repeatedly. I will do it, Mother. I swear. I was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I don't need oaths. I need action. Richard bowed his head. Mother, what if I follow your plan? Your future will be yours to decide, but remember, there is no starting over if you step on others again. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden Thomas had tended. The roses were blooming brilliantly in the late light. Your father left you $30 million, but he also left me the power to strip you of everything. Today I have not done that, but if you betray me again, I will not hesitate. When I turned back, tears streaked down Paul's face. Richard rose and bowed deeply. Mother, I'm sorry. I nodded. Don't apologize. Prove it. The door closed behind them, and for the first time in this house, I heard the most pleasant silence of my life. The silence of justice. I looked at Thomas's portrait on the wall and whispered, My love, I did it. But this is not the end. It's only the beginning of their redemption. A week later, the Hillman Group headquarters gleamed in the morning light. Employees who had been used to seeing Richard step out of his luxury car were stunned to see me, Margaret Hillman, step out of a modest silver sedan. No bodyguards, no show, just a 69-year-old woman in a charcoal gray suit, her silver hair neatly pinned, her gaze direct and decisive. The boardroom doors opened. 30 employees, people who had held their breath under Richard's rule, stood up. I smiled gently. Please sit. Effective today, I will be the official head of Hillman Group. No one spoke. I knew how they saw me. A grieving mother with no business sense. I slowly opened the file on the table. For 45 years, I sat at the dinner table and listened to my husband speak about every project, every contract. I know how he struggled, how he had to sell cars and parcels of land to keep the company alive. I may not have the title CEO, but I lived it. I understood it, and I loved it. A light cough came from the corner. Frank, a veteran site manager, asked cautiously, Mrs. Hillman, with all due respect, what is your plan to pull the company out of crisis? I looked at him, then at everyone. I didn't come to save it. I came to cleanse it. I turned on the large screen. A list of irregular expenditures, fake invoices, and shady charges under Richard's management filled the display. Murmurs rippled through the room. I've hired independent auditors. From today, Hillman Group will operate by 3 principles: honesty, accountability, and sharing. Whoever has been at fault, I will not hide. Whoever has done right, I will not let suffer. A few employees exchanged looks. A young man stood and applauded. The clapping spread, and then the whole room joined in. I felt my throat tighten. For the first time, I was not just the shadow of Thomas. I was Margaret Hillman, standing on my own 2 feet. That afternoon, I visited the construction site where Richard was now working as a laborer. From a distance, I saw my son carrying bricks, sweat soaking his shirt. When he saw me, he quietly set the bricks down and didn't dare look up. I approached. Tired? I asked. No, Mother. I need this. I looked at his calloused hands and for a moment saw a flash of the young Thomas. I nodded without speaking and handed him a bottle of cold water. In the evening, I stopped by the restaurant chain Paul had managed. A team of young staff were now discussing a restructuring plan. Paul called from rehab, his voice shaky but lucid. Mother, I'm sorry. I want to reopen Dad's community kitchen project. Restaurants for the poor and lonely elderly. I want to do that when I'm out. I smiled, and for the first time in months, felt genuine relief. Your father would be proud, Paul." That night, I sat alone in Thomas's old office. His photos still hung on the walls, his expression gentle and resolute. I opened the drawer and took out the old envelope, the one the family had mocked. It was now more yellowed, but to me it was a symbol of power and a new beginning. I looked out the window at the city lights sparkling. "My love," I whispered, "I have stepped out of your shadow, but you remain here, in every decision, in every change I make." The phone rang. It was George. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hillman. Today the company stock rose 18% after news of your return was released. The press is calling you the Iron Woman of Hillman Valley." I laughed. "I'm not iron, George. I'm just a mother who learned to be firm at the right time." As night fell, I sat by the window and wrote the first line of my new plan, the Eleanor Fund, supporting abandoned elderly women. I no longer sought revenge. I wanted to rebuild, not only the company, but the broken pieces of trust, family, and myself. Outside, the lights reflected on the glass, and in them I saw a completely new woman, steady, strong, and free. 6 months had passed since the day I reopened the doors of Hillman Group's office. The old bricks of the past had been replaced with a new foundation, not built from money, but from trust. The company now runs steadily. The first social housing project I initiated has been completed, providing decent homes for hundreds of working families. But what makes me prouder than profit is the Hillman Foundation for Women, the organization I established from the assets Thomas left behind. The foundation's goal is straightforward: to support older women who have been abandoned, betrayed, or denied their right to live by their families. I was once one of them, so I know that feeling well. Being treated as a burden, being silenced, being erased from the family portrait. Now I want women like me to be seen, heard, and respected. Every week I visit the foundation's first center in the suburbs. There, a dozen silver-haired women cook together, sew, tend flowers, learn computers, and laugh out loud. Among them is Mrs. Nora, 72, whose daughter took all her savings and forced her out of the house. When she saw me, she grasped my hand tightly, eyes wet. "If it weren't for your center, I wouldn't have survived. Thank you for letting us see that old age still has value." I hugged her, feeling her thin yet warm hand. In that moment, I realized my most significant victory was not holding on to money, but giving at the right time. That afternoon, I returned to the office. George Milton came in with a bright smile. "Mrs. Hillman, you've been nominated for Most Influential Woman of the Year. The INC authorities are also considering partnering with your foundation to open 3 more centers nationwide." I merely smiled softly. Award or not, what matters is what we are doing. I don't need praise. I need people to start seeing the elderly with different eyes. George nodded, his gaze full of respect. "Thomas would be very proud." I looked out the window. I no longer do this for Thomas, George. I do it for all the women who once bowed their heads and endured as I did. Just then the phone rang. It was Paul calling from the rehabilitation center. My son's voice sounded clear and more lucid than ever. "Mom, today I went out to work for the first time. I'm helping the center rebuild the kitchen area. Mom, I feel like I'm rebuilding my life." I smiled, my eyes stinging. "You've started, Paul. Keep going." That evening, Richard stopped by. He was thinner and tanner, but his eyes carried a light they never had before. "Mom," he said, "today the workers on my crew called me Rich instead of boss. It felt strange, but good. For the first time, I'm proud of my own hands." I looked at him, was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "That's what your father always wanted. Now, do you understand him?" Richard nodded. "I understand. Father built an empire not for us to merely enjoy, but for us to learn how to create value." We sat in silence. Only the clock ticked, and a peace settled over me that I had thought would never return. That night, I wrote in my journal, Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means seeing someone trying to become better. Like a flame, it can burn, but it can also warm if used the right way. A few weeks later, the Hillman Foundation held its first anniversary. More than 300 people attended, including entrepreneurs, social activists, and the women the foundation had helped. I stepped onto the stage, my voice trembling but confident. We cannot change the past, but we can rewrite the rest of our lives. I once lost everything: my husband, my faith, my family, but from that ash I found a new flame, a flame of meaning, of dignity, of love. The whole hall rose to applaud. In the warm light, I saw two familiar silhouettes, Richard and Paul, standing in the back row, clapping quietly, their faces full of pride. I knew then the Hillman family had truly been reborn. 1 year after I opened Thomas's letter, the Hillman backyard was more beautiful than ever. Roses, Thomas's favorite, bloomed along the path and gave off a scent soft as memory. I sat under the porch roof, a cup of tea still steaming, the old envelope on the table, evidence of a past I once thought shameful, now a symbol of rebirth. My life had changed. I was no longer the woman who feared being abandoned. I had become the author of my own story. Under the new leadership, Hillman Group had become a model of transparency and humanity. The second social housing project had just been completed, and the Hillman Foundation had helped more than 500 older women secure housing, jobs, and reasons to smile again. But what fulfilled me most was not the company or the charity. It was family. The thing I thought had turned to dust, now slowly being restored. Paul is now a recovery counselor at the center. He kept his promise, not only rebuilding his own life, but helping others to save theirs. "Mom," Paul said when he visited one day, "I met a young man, just a little younger than I was. He told me I was the first person who made him believe he could change. Maybe that is the real reward for my mistakes." I hugged him, feeling the warmth of the child I once thought had been lost forever. Richard is different. He has given up expensive suits and now manages affordable housing construction projects, building schools and clinics. One day, he came to my house, knelt by Thomas's altar, and whispered, "Father, I can't undo what I did, but I promise to live as you taught, with clean hands and a heart that feels shame." I stood behind him, tears quietly falling, not tears of sorrow, but tears of forgiveness. That afternoon, when the whole family gathered, I took out the old envelope. Richard and Paul looked at it with reverence, no longer as two greedy men, but as sons who understood the value of a mother who had been wounded to the core. I smiled. "In the past, you treated this as trash. Today, I keep it as a treasure, because from this envelope I learned the most precious thing. Money can be taken, fame can be stolen, but self-respect and dignity cannot be touched by anyone." Paul asked softly, "Mom, do you ever regret forgiving us?" I placed my hand on his shoulder and replied, "Forgiveness isn't for forgetting. Forgiveness is to free oneself. I don't forgive you because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." The three of us sat beneath the tree, sunlight filtering through golden leaves. I suddenly realized Thomas had never truly left. He remained present in every decision, every change, in every person we had shaped together. A month later, the Hillman Foundation held its second-year celebration. I walked onto the stage in a deep blue dress, the lights shining, and hundreds of people, from women entrepreneurs to the silver-haired mothers the foundation had helped, looked up at me. I began my speech. At 69, I thought my life was over, but Thomas, my late husband, left me a lesson. Every ending is only a disguise for a new beginning. I was once a victim of betrayal, but today I stand here believing forgiveness has power, just as justice does. The hall was silent. I continued. Don't wait until you have lost everything to recognize the value of family. Money can build a house, but only love builds a home. Look around you. Your father, your mother, your partner. They are treasures no will can buy. Applause thundered through the auditorium. I saw Richard and Paul standing at the back, their eyes glistening with tears. And I knew, in the end, they understood. That night, back at home, I placed the old envelope on my desk next to Thomas's wedding photo. I touched it gently and whispered, "Thank you for leaving me not only money, but the chance to live again. Strong, whole, and free." The wind blew through the window, stirring the red roses in the garden. I sipped my tea and smiled. My life at 70 was no longer an echo. It was the main melody. One message kept echoing. No one is too old to begin again. No one is too late to be loved, and no wound is beyond healing if we have the courage to forgive.